good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all doing? Happy Easter. The Lord is risen.
The Lord is risen indeed.
Hallelujah. All right, well, welcome to the spring break edition of the Bible theology class. So I'm glad you all made it. We are going to be talking this morning about resurrection, and especially in the early church. And we've got a little bit of just like theologians, early theologians, and we have a little bit of sort of how it worked in liturgy, early church liturgy, and a bit of art. Next week we'll talk about the resurrection in Christian art. And just a little teaser for next week. One of the amazing things about the resurrection is that there's no actual attempt to depict the resurrection itself for about 1,000 years. So until about the year 1000. So we'll uncover that mystery tomorrow. Why is it that we don't actually depict it? It's related to the problem of why they don't depict the crucifixion until about the year 400. Yeah.
The question, did they, what other things did they depict in that first 1,000 years?
Show up next week and we'll see. Or if you're not going to be here next week, I'll give you a hint after class. But in any event, we'll save the suspense. But basically allegorical or symbolic depictions of the resurrection were the only ways to depict the resurrection for the first 1,000 years. In any event, we'll today talk about we'll kind of build up to that, but we'll start by reviewing a bit of sort of ancient Judaism and the world of the New Testament before we move into the early church. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. God, we thank you for this resurrection Easter season. We thank you for the promise of life, of new life, of renewed life. We thank you that we can see this at work within our own world, within our own lives, within our own communities. We also see at work amongst us still, even today, the work of death, of evil, of sin, of destruction. We pray that in the midst of things that seem to be falling apart, whether it's global or personal, whether it's communal, whether it's in our work lives or our church lives or our family lives, we pray that you would bless us with peace, with hope, with joy at the sprouting of your Easter news, that Christ, the first fruit, is risen again. Help us to look forward to the day when all things will be renewed, and help us to be patient in the meantime. Amen. All right, so talk about resurrection this semester, and for the next few weeks, I think it's like 4 weeks or so, the next 4 weeks we'll be talking about resurrection. On the syllabus, we'll go to art next week, as I said, and then we'll have a couple of weeks, which I don't remember right now what we're doing, although I tried to refresh myself this morning earlier. But anyway, the idea is we talked about in the fall, of course 2 years ago we talked about incarnation for a year, and in the fall we talked about, what did we talk about in the fall? Incarnation in the fall, and then resurrection now. We talked about last year. Oh, Christology, Christ. Yeah. There you go. Okay, I'm refreshing myself on what we've been doing.
We talked about sin too during Lent.
Talked about sin during Lent, which leads into this discussion of resurrection, right? And the whole point of like why does there have to be a resurrection? Why not just have life and life unending from the very beginning? So in any event, we're rejoining this, but also we'll be tying in some of the stuff. And if there's anything that we learned about over the course of the last few weeks in Lent about sin, feel free to ask questions about that, or to ask questions to catch yourself up on, or catch us all up, me too, on what we've been doing. So, let me actually, I guess I gotta pull this in a bit. All right, so when we talk about the early church, we've got to talk about the cultures in which it was situated. The first of those being ancient Judaism, but also within the Greco-Roman culture that surrounded it. And within which Judaism really emerged as a religion on its own, that is apart from ancient Israelite religion. So we can really talk about the transition to Judaism taking a long time, but the kind of transition to Judaism that we can recognize happens after the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70 CE.
Brian?
Yes?
Is there a difference between Judaism and ancient Israelite religion?
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to make that distinction, because ancient Israelite religion is a religion of sacrifice within the temple. It's a religion that itself changes over a long period of time. There's actually different versions of it. There's ancient Israelite religions. There's actually several different ways we can see that ancient Israelites worshipped their god Yahweh, and different ways they did it, and they had different conceptions of how that worked. But Judaism, we would say, is different. It's an outgrowth of ancient Israelite religion, but it's not based on the sacrificial system of the temple. It's based on a synagogue system. There are no priests in sort of Judaism as we know it today, right? There's rabbis, which are really lay leaders, and so they don't conceive of themselves as priests. So in that sense, what we see is a development from some of the religious ideas that were afloat at the time of Jesus, and the Pharisees being one of the main groups of religious lay leaders at the time of Jesus, that develops really into the religion of Judaism, the rabbinical religion that we know of today. So, of course, there's a lineage. I'm not saying that there's some sort of dramatic break because they're using the same scriptures that ancient Israelite religion produced. But I would say that the scholars of religion would say, yeah, there's a different mode of relating to God that we see here. We relate to God through prayers in the contemporary Jewish community, but they related to God through prayers and through sacrifice in ancient Israelite religion. So we'd say it's kind of a different system. In the same way, Christianity emerges out of ancient Israelite religion. We read the Old Testament, which is the scriptures produced by ancient Israelite religion, but at the same time, we believe some different things too. So Judaism doesn't just read what we call the Old Testament or what they call the Tanakh, where they don't just read the Torah. They have the Torah and they have the Mishnah and the Talmud. The Talmud kind of being the commentary on the Mishnah being the early teachings of the rabbis for the first couple of centuries after the destruction of the temple. So Jewish religion emerges out of the destruction of the temple in the same way that we would say that Christianity emerges out of the destruction of the sort of the Jewish milieu out of the destruction of the temple as well. And so that in that sort of aftermath of that event, you have these two religions that for a while are actually inseparable. Christians thought of themselves as Jews, and then there was a fight, right, between Peter and Paul about like whether or not Gentiles are even allowed in. But the way that Paul talks about it in Romans chapters 9 through 11 is that if Gentiles are allowed into this church, which Paul was advocating for, that they're allowed in by being grafted into Israel, so that is that they become Jews. So we have like a special kind of in to the Jewish community through Jesus, but we don't have to like leave our ethnic cultural heritage behind to become Jews. We can sort of a trapdoor into the Jewish community. But in any event, so that's the way that Paul talks about it. So in other words, for the first few centuries, there's not a real hard divide between Christianity and Judaism, and then there is, especially when Christianity becomes the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Then there's a big divide between Christianity and Judaism, and it just hardens after that. Does that make sense, or does that help?
Yes, thank you.
So within Hellenistic Judaism, which included Christianity in a way, we can see that there's a kind of melding of two worldviews. I've got these two pictures here to represent this. This is a sort of a Greek, this is not a Jewish image, this is a Greek image on a Greek vase, a painted image of a person. You can see the body of the person here, but it's got this, what we might call a psyche, what they would have called a psyche, a soul, a spirit kind of above. And you can see it's kind of got these little wings and stuff. This is the person's soul. It's the thing that lived within the person that was actually there before the body in Platonic thought, in Plato's thought. So in other words, kind of like the body is like this shell, kind of a mortal shell around this immortal soul that has pre-existed the body. And that the body will someday be kind of shuffled off. And the soul has the possibility of kind of returning back to this world that's beautiful in the sky and getting rid of all the gross earth stuff. Aristotle has a slightly different way of talking about the soul. He thinks that the soul forms only once there's a body, but still he thinks that like the soul is kind of this, connection to other things. It's a kind of a more of a spiritual connection to other things, whereas the body is still kind of this bunch of gross meat that we need to kind of get rid of someday. On the opposite side from this, but this, Hellenistic Judaism is a melding between these two traditions of the Greco-Roman ideas. So they don't reject these ideas necessarily, but they try to work with them within categories of ancient Israelite thought. I'm pointing over here because this is a picture of the story in the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 7. Maccabees is an apocryphal book that some Christians call that. It's a book or deuterocanonical, second canon. It's kind of junior varsity Bible is one way of thinking about it for Christians. It was a Jewish text created just before the time of Jesus, and it's talking about this time of persecution when a Greek emperor living in Syria was persecuting Jerusalem and persecuting the Jews. And so there's 7 sons of this holy, righteous woman who are martyred. And in this story, as the children are being martyred, they say to the king, we will come back. Our bodies will come back. And this is really a very Jewish perspective. And I should say that within Judaism, there was even at the time of Jesus, there's this kind of tension, really, between resurrection. The Pharisees are pro-resurrection, the body's going to come back. There's another group that you've heard of, the Sadducees. They're kind of the elite in the temple, probably, and they think that there is no resurrection. So there's a fight within Judaism about the resurrection, even at the time of Jesus. But still, there's a great, sort of probably popular support for this kind of very physical resurrection that people think is going to happen at some time, just to the righteous, so not to all people. And this is, I'd say, a very Jewish idea that comes from ancient Israelite religion, because ancient Israelite religion and all the people of the ancient Near East, except for maybe Egypt, you can argue, they don't have much of a division between soul and body. That's just not a big thing. So in ancient Israelite religion, if you read like Genesis 1 and 2, right, the human is kind of formed in the image of God. In Genesis 2, God kind of takes some dirt and kind of forms the human and then breathes God's breath into it and kind of animates it. And so there's this notion of breath, but it's not a soul. It's like we can breathe. That's like our soul. When you see soul in the Old Testament, like in the Psalms, it says like, "Bless the Lord, O my soul," Psalm 103. It's actually kind of a bad translation. That Hebrew word is nephesh, which means breath. It literally means throat. Bless the Lord, O my throat. But what it means is the place of respiration, the fact that you can breathe. That's like your soul. So it doesn't. It can be used kind of to mean your whole self in a way, but it doesn't mean this like thing that's independently, like what's called a homunculus, like the little tiny person inside your brain that drives your body. Like that's the Greek idea of your soul. This like non-physical thing that drives your brain inside you. Ancient Israelites like you are a body. Your soul is a bone. It's a bone inside your body. It's a thing. Like you, and it's you. Like your whole self. So ancient Israelite religion, you die, your body dies, you're dead, you're gone. There's maybe this little kind of breath thing that goes on after you, but really it just hangs out in this place called Sheol, this land underneath the ground where everything just kind of sits there and rests. Like, so in other words, you really are resting. Like there's no activity down there really. That's the way the ancient Israelites think about death and the human body, and this notion of a soul. So that's why physical resurrection is a big deal to ancient Israelites, because the body's important to them. You are a body. Your body matters. Ancient Greeks, they think your body matters like for now, like in the short term. Like they have kind of physical ideals of beauty and stuff like that, but really what you are is a soul. And you kind of, most people in the kind of Greco-Roman area of the world, so Mediterranean basin, including at this point in time ancient Israel or Palestine, including Judea. So that region of the world, folks are sort of enmeshed in this and kind of participating in this notion that the kind of material world is questionable. It's got some questionable stuff to it. So, ancient Israelites, they think that God said the world is good, right? We hear that 7 times in Genesis 1. The world is good. Things are good. There's some problems with the world. Of course, humans create that stuff in Genesis 2 and 3. But the world is necessarily good. For Greeks, the world is necessarily suspicious. So, within this kind of combined, like in both Christians and Jews in the Hellenistic milieu are trying to figure out a combination of these 2 points of view. They're not trying to reject Greco-Roman thought entirely, although there are some people who do, but usually they're trying to like kind of make some concessions to Greco-Roman thought, because it's just what everyone believes, but also they're trying to stake out a position that retains the notion that the physical world is good and the body is good. And that, I think there's some good solutions and some bad solutions to that, but anyway. So Paul, as we read last time, he talks in Romans chapter 1 a lot about the kind of resurrection of Jesus, incorporating what I think is an earlier creedal saying from the very early church in Jerusalem. Paul also has a lengthy discourse in 1 Corinthians 15 where he's talking about this. He's trying to like talk to Greek people in Corinth, the church in Corinth and Greece, who are fully enmeshed in Greek society, thinking about like the kind of the body soul split and so on. Trying to tell them, no, I really think I kind of like the body. I understand what you're saying, that there's problems with the body and so on. So he talks about this. The resurrection is kind of a spiritual body. It's better than the body 2.0, So he's trying to kind of work this out, but it's all, you can tell he's working it out, like on paper as he's writing. You ever do that? Like when you're working on a math problem or something, you're like halfway through, you're like, I don't know where I'm going, I'm just going to keep going with this, right? Or you're in the middle of an argument with a friend and you're like, I'm not really sure I'm going to end up here, but I'm just going to keep going. I think Paul's working it out on paper as he goes. or on papyrus as he goes. But he's creating the groundwork, and the thing that I think is important about Paul is that he's trying to retain, in some way, both. He's trying to say, okay, there is a point that the Greco-Roman people have about the fact that, like, maybe we're not just bodies, there's a little bit more to us than that. But also he says it's not like, the body is still important. We still have to retain there's some sort of continuity about the human body that's important in our life, but also in the hereafter. And for Christians, of course, in the Gospels we have several different stories. They don't quite agree, but all of them have, the main point is that the body wasn't there. The body of Jesus isn't there in the tomb. It's gone. Something happened to it. And that there's different ways of explaining this. Christ is risen. There's the resurrection of the dead is a phrase that's used in the Gospels. The resurrection of the flesh is actually not used in the Gospels. I think this is actually kind of an important thing to talk about. So, but we'll get to this more today. But the main point, I think, is that in the Gospels, Jesus' body isn't there. And then the disciples in several of the Gospels have sort of interactions with a risen Christ whose body is weird, right? It's he can walk through doors that are locked, right? In the Gospel of John, he can appear in places that maybe like are strange that he shouldn't be in. He knows stuff. He knows where the disciples are going to be without talking to them. So there's something kind of superhuman about this body. At the exact same time, you can touch it, you can hold it. Jesus eats food and it doesn't like fall to the ground or something like that, through a ghost body. So there's something extra about this body. It's not normal, but also there's physical reality to it. And there's the discussion of the wounds, right? That there's Jesus still bears marks, right? In John, the gospel we read today, right? There's, it's kind of, the idea is that Thomas could even like put his fingers, inside the hole in Jesus' side. So there's something still retained about what happened in this life with this spiritual body that's been raised. It's not just perfect. So the important thing I think to pull from this is there's a few key ideas that you can see throughout all these Gospels. The body's important. There's something different about it. We have to proclaim this thing. In all the Gospels, people are told, tell this story. Tell people about this. It's a sign or symbol about something bigger about the earth and about people's destiny. The questions that are unaddressed are any practical ramifications. So, it's just not there. I mean, Paul barely touches this stuff too. Like, for example, what age are you going to be when you get raised? Oh, okay. So, are you going to be a 30-year-old body, a 50-year-old body, 70-year-old body? Or, what happens if you get cremated? What happens? If this is kind of a philosophical thing that the Greeks would pose, non-Christian Greeks would pose to Christians talking about the resurrection. They'd say, okay. So let's say a person is eaten by an animal, and then another person catches that animal and eats it. So, right, what's God going to do with the pieces, right? There's these kind of philosophical conundrums about, if I digest animal that's digested a person, and then some of the atoms of my body are now the atoms of that animal's body, which have some of the atoms of the other person's body in it. Like, what do I do? Oh no! Are you going to have to get a haircut in the hereafter? If I grow a beard sometimes and then not a beard sometimes in this life, what am I going to have a beard in the hereafter or not? Right? So the Gospels and Paul are completely silent about any of these points. They just don't care. Right? It's not important. It just remains a mystery. But Christians don't always think these questions are totally unimportant. So we'll see the development of some of that today. Okay. So as the church develops. Basically, the four Gospels are written sometime, probably maybe right before the destruction of the temple is when Mark is. Mark's the earliest Gospel, sometime just before 70 CE. And then the other Gospels probably fit in sometime in the remainder of the first century, so sometime right before the year 100. So as the Gospel of John is probably hot off the presses as it's being written, we have some of the earliest Christian writings that are not in the Bible. So we'll talk about that today. So this guy, Clement of Rome, when I say this guy, this is not really a picture of Clement, whatever, but I'm going to show some art from contemporary and some medieval communities that actually try to depict some of these folk. But this is Clement, one of the earliest Christian theologians that we know of, that we have record of what he actually thought. He wrote a letter to the Corinthian church. He was the Bishop of Rome, which it says here, Clement I Papa, the Pope, right? So it wasn't called the Pope back then. He was just the Bishop of Rome, which was an important church, but not the only important church. But so he was Bishop of Rome probably from sometime around the year 92 to 101. And so we've got one letter and maybe a sermon from his that were both given to the church in Corinth. So we don't know exactly where this guy came from. We don't know that much about him even, but he had some clear connection to the Corinthian church. He might have been from Corinth and become Bishop of Rome or something.
He wrote a letter that was not included in our epistles?
Right. A letter sometime probably around the year 95, AD or CE, and it's not in the Bible. Part of the reason it's not in the Bible is probably because it was written to a particular church and probably didn't get larger circulation until after the time when there was kind of a notion of the canon that had already started to develop. But still, it was preserved in several different copies, and so we know that it was at least a little bit important to people outside of the church in Corinth. But so he basically lays out the Christian message to the church in Corinth. And it's just like Paul. Remember Paul in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, he's trying to convince the church in Corinth, like, here's kind of how we live and so on. Here's how we believe in Jesus. Clement's still got to do that. So by 50 years after Paul, Clement's still writing letters. People are still writing letters to the church in Corinth trying to help him out. So one of the things he talks about is the resurrection. And he doesn't actually spend very much time on it, which means that there probably isn't a terrible conflict in Corinth of the resurrection like there was with 1 Corinthians when Paul wrote. But he does do a couple of really interesting things to let us see what the resurrection was like for how they conceived it in their lives. So he says that he keeps on coming back to images of the natural world, like seeds. A seed goes into the ground, and kind of the seed itself dies in the sense that the seed isn't there anymore. You can't point to the seed, but that a root system grows from it, and something grows. It points to the seasons. We have spring every year after winter, and so on. So there's this kind of dying and rising imagery in the natural world, and he points this out several times in his first letter to the Corinthians. So Clement was also the first Christian to be able to know to relate, and you all should be excited about this from being in Atlanta. The first ever Christian to relate the myth, the Greco-Roman myth of the dying and rising of the phoenix, resurgence, right? Atlanta. So the dying and rising of the phoenix to Christ. But it's from pagan mythology. It was a Greco-Roman myth, really, a Greek myth, that had to do with Egypt. So it's kind of borrowing some mythology from Egypt, but reworking it in a Greek way to come up with this idea of the phoenix. And the phoenix is this bird that kind of dies and then rises from its own ashes. It's a much longer story than that. But anyway, so Clement uses this story to kind of talk about Jesus, which shows that Christians they're just grabbing whatever they can to talk about Jesus. And examples from pagan mythology, it's fine, it's okay. So this is what we might call syncretism today, or sort of cultural appropriation. Clement also gives what's probably a sermon to Corinth right around the year 100, and it's what we now call Second Clement. It's like presented to us as a letter, but it sounds a lot more like a sermon than a letter. And there's, at least what theologians think is a pretty significant development in the way that Christians talk about the resurrection. And Clement, if Clement is the author of this, we're not quite sure Clement wrote this, but whatever, we'll say he did. And Clement says that if Christ won salvation in the flesh, this is a quotation, if Christ won salvation in the flesh you will receive your reward. So the flesh, using that word flesh is actually really important here. And what's interesting is that Paul uses the word body, but actually the word flesh, like flesh, is not actually used in the New Testament to talk about the resurrection. So this is an innovation. And it's that in Greek, those are two different words. Soma means body, and it can mean body in lots of different ways. But sarx means flesh. And whenever you use flesh, sarx, in the New Testament, it means like the kind of, when Paul's talking about his body and he lets him down, and he in Romans chapter 7, he's talking about how sinful person that I am, I have this body of flesh and so on. He's kind of like talking bad about the body. It's a little bit of the Greek world coming into Paul's thought. He uses the word sarx. It's a negative, bad thing. But here, the church, just 50 years after Paul, starts to rehabilitate the notion that your flesh is actually a good thing, and that the resurrection involves your flesh rather than just a body. So anyway, this is, I think, a new and kind of different thing.
Brandon,
yes.
Along those lines, in our literature, we talk about the body of Christ.
Yeah.
What sort of body is that?
Yeah, great question. So this is when Paul is talking, and actually also in 1 Corinthians and several other times, talks about the body of Christ, meaning the church. So one of the things that happens after the resurrection, we don't actually talk about this that much in church, but there's the ascension, right? So in Acts, we also get a notion of this in Matthew and in Luke. There's this kind of ascension, right? That Christ goes up to heaven. So Christ's body is here for a little while, right? There's the 50 days of Easter or whatever. Christ appears to some people, and then Christ is gone. you can't find Christ's physical body on earth anymore. You could for a while, the kind of supernatural, body 2.0, you go through walls or whatever, eat some fish, but also like, that was possible to see for a while, and now it's just vanished. So what do we have here now on earth? Well, we have the Spirit, this kind of non-corporeal thing that is Christ's presence that kind of floats among us as fire, as water, as wind, doing stuff like making people speak in tongues and Acts, but like it's you can't touch it. But the other thing that we have is the church. And for Paul, this is a hugely important thing, is if you want to touch Jesus, you have to not just touch one Christian, you have to get a bunch of Christians together. And that's the body of Christ. Like that's the physical aspect of Christ, like in this age that we're living in, before Christ returns. Does that make sense? So for him, like Paul would think, yes, Christ has some sort of spiritual, not spiritual, I guess he calls it a spiritual body. He kind of melds those two words. It's like body 2.0. Jesus has a body 2.0, but now it's in heaven. It's sitting next to God, right hand of God the Father, right? It's not here. So if you want to meet Jesus, the only way to meet Jesus is to meet and meet other Christians. And then the Spirit kind of produces the body of Christ. I don't know if that's
Soma?
That's the soma, yeah, the body of Christ, that's soma. So it can be used in a metaphorical sense and so on. It's not sarx, the flesh. So anyway, these early Christians, so here's a copy, here's a parchment copy of the letter of Clement to the Corinthians. And here's just a little quote from it. Do we then deem it any great and wonderful thing for the maker of all things to raise up again those that piously served? And he uses a quote from the book of Job. Chapter 19, verse 25. For Job says, you shall raise up this flesh of mine which has suffered all these things. So, there's a flesh, raising up of the flesh, and so on. And that's hugely important for Clement. So, just a few years later, there's Ignatius of Antioch, who is martyred in Rome. He's from the city of Antioch, which that's the city where Paul and Peter get into a big fight. It's like the hub of early Christianity, most important city in early Christianity. It was destroyed in an earthquake in the 4th century, which is why it's not a big deal after that. But in any event, for the first few centuries, it was actually more important than Rome as a hub for Christianity. But so Ignatius is the bishop of Antioch, and he's arrested and sent to Rome and actually ends up being martyred right around the year 107. And Ignatius, on his way, he's on the boat, being sent to Rome to be killed, and he writes 7 letters to 7 different churches. Sounds a little bit like the book of Revelation. And he writes this one letter to the Smyrnians, the church in Smyrna, Georgia. So 2,000 years later, they're very surprised to receive it. So the ancient Greek city of Smyrna in Asia Minor. But so Ignatius speaks of the flesh and the spirit in this letter quite a bit. So this is from the letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 3, verse 3. And you can just Google Ignatius of Antioch, letter to the Smyrnians. You can read some of this early Christian stuff. It's all online, all translated. Several different websites have just the collection of early Christian theological writings. And this letter to the Smyrnians, he says, and after his resurrection, Christ ate and drank with them, that is the disciples, just like someone composed of flesh, that is sarx, although spiritually he was united with the Father. So in other words, we have this kind of, he wants to say it's body 2.0, and the important part of this body 2.0, and you can see this in Paul too, is that it's spiritually united with the Father, with God. So in other words, unity with God is the important, when you talk about the spiritual body, what kind of doesn't matter to the early Christian theologians is do you have a beard or not, or do you have to go to the bathroom or not, or what age are you? They just don't care. What they care about is the spiritual dimension. The body 2.0 part of this is that you are with God, you are one united with God. So that's what's important. And we can see Ignatius of Antioch thinks that's important too. Here's Justin Martyr, another early Christian theologian. He was also martyred in Rome. His name wasn't just, he wasn't named. His parents didn't say you're Justin Martyr. He was Justin. But he ended up being martyred, known as Justin Martyr. He was an apologist, one of the first Christian apologists. That is, he wrote these long defenses of Christianity. So what's different is Ignatius and Clement of Rome, they're writing long letters to Christian communities just like Paul is. And what's different about Justin is he's the inauguration of a new kind of generation, the next generation of Christian theologians who are, Christianity's gotten big enough to the point where people are starting to ask questions about it. Romans, the Roman leaders, are really suspicious of Christianity now, and we start to see persecutions of Christians. We have a letter from right around the time of Justin Martyr from a Roman leader who is very suspicious of the Christians, and he seems to be suspicious that they're an immoral and atheistic lot. Now maybe I'll ask you, why do you think that the Romans would have thought that the early Christians were atheists?
One God?
What's that?
One God?
Maybe one God, but yeah. Didn't believe the Roman gods, right? Rome's a polytheistic. There are gods everywhere. You know, like they accept your God, whoever you are, and your God might be kind of a minor. Like your big God might be their minor God, the pantheon, whatever. But they kind of take all comers, right? They're okay. They're religious pluralists, hierarchical pluralists, right? You know, Jupiter's at the top. But for them, the important thing is that you got to be accepting of other people's gods. The Jews are strange within the Roman Empire precisely because they don't like other people's gods. They don't accept them. But the Jews have a homeland. The Christians, they're at this point, so there are Jewish leaders who start to say, these followers of Jesus they're not really ours. So the Romans get really suspicious because now there are these people that they say they worship the Jewish God, but the Jews don't say they worship the Jewish God, and they say that no other God exists. So they have no God and no homeland. They're atheists and they're like wanderers, you know, like they're just like, for the Romans this is just disgusting. And then the Romans start to like listen in to their meetings. They're like, are they talking about eating a person's body? They're cannibals. And they talk about having love feasts, agape feasts, where they get together in someone's house and they all have, I don't know, love? This is disgusting. They are fornicators, they are like cannibals, they are atheists, and so on. So there's going to be the persecutions against the Christians begin really because of this they're thought to be disgusting. So, as a result, the Christian theologians switch gears. They stop, and they don't just stop, they continue to do the work within their own communities. But what becomes most important for some of the major theologians of the next century is trying to get unity among Christian believers precisely so that they can present almost like a unified front to the Romans. Say, here's what we believe, here's what we are about. And they were worried that if there's lots of different Christian leaders that are saying lots of different things, that the Romans will continue to persecute them, and that the Roman people amongst whom they're living will still cease to understand. If they understand what one Christian says and they hear another Christian say something entirely different, it's just no one's going to get the message. And Christians are told to preach the message, Christ is risen. So what does it mean that Christ is risen? Well, so Justin Martyr actually writes a bunch of different apologies where he's arguing with Jewish leaders, he's arguing with even the Emperor of Rome. He writes an entire letter and sends it to Marcus Aurelius, who himself styled, the Emperor of Rome, styled himself as a philosopher. So Justin, who was actually trained as a philosopher, he's actually from Palestine, he's from the city of Nablus, which still exists today. And he was a Roman born there, and he learned philosophy as a Roman, and then later on became a Christian, converted to Christianity, moves to Rome in order to write this philosophical defense of Christianity for the Roman emperor to preserve the Christians. So he talks a lot about resurrection. Clement didn't talk as much about resurrection, in part because Christians believe the resurrection. It's kind of what Christians do, right? So Clement doesn't have to spend a lot of time talking about that, but Justin has to a lot because this is a terrible, disgusting thing in the Greco-Roman world to say that the human body is going to get raised up. You're going to get stuck back in your body? Damn it, they would say. We just got out of this thing. We want to go up to, ascend to the world of the Platonic ideals and so on. So Justin has to talk about this a lot. So he teaches, of course he dies for it. He ends up being martyred. But he teaches a resurrection of the flesh and uses that word a lot. So he's also the first one to use the term second coming, to put the word second in front of coming. So Christians talk about Jesus coming back in the New Testament, but this idea that he's trying to map out what's happening. There's going to be a first coming, a second coming. He talks about there's 1,000 years in between the first and second coming. He's got this kind of specified, what we might call eschatology, or teaching about the end times. So he believes that human bodies will be revived and assume immortality, and he believes in the immortality of the soul. So, in other words, he's taking this Greco-Roman idea of the immortality of the soul. He thinks that God creates the soul. Once God's created the soul, it's indestructible. So your soul will go marching on after you die. It doesn't need a body. This is a new and different thing for Christianity. This probably comes from the fact that Justin is a Roman. He's not a Jew first. He becomes a Christian and brings his Roman theology and philosophy into Christianity. So we start to get this kind of split within Christianity at this point between people who believe in the immortality of the soul and people who don't believe in the immortality of the soul. That is, when your body dies, you die. And then when God raises you, you raise. And now there are people who say, well, when you die, your spirit kind of goes marching on. We don't really see that in the New Testament. Now, that's not to say that it's bad. We also don't see the word Trinity in the New Testament. So early Christians are working on these ideas of who is Jesus? Is Jesus fully God, not fully God, adopted, whatever? The early Christians are working on that. They're working on the idea, how does Jesus relate to the Holy Spirit, relate to God the Father? How does those things tie together and so on? So early Christians are working on all this stuff. Included with that is this notion of the soul. What is the soul? So whatever you believe about the soul, take heart. Early Christians believed with you too, just not all of them, right? So they were greatly divided on this issue. So Justin represents that new, I think, change within Christian thought. He also uses, like the New Testament, the phrase resurrection of the dead a lot. That's what the New Testament says, resurrection of the dead, unspecific about exactly what happens to the body. But then he also uses resurrection of the flesh. So Justin is kind of melding these two, this kind of Jewish idea, the kind of New Testament idea, then the kind of Jewish notion of the positivity of the flesh, the positivity of the body, and then also the immortality of the soul. Now, a little bit further on in history, Irenaeus of Lyon is from Lyon, France. So Irenaeus is a Roman guy living in the city of Lyon, which would one day become a very beautiful place. I'm sure he would be excited to see it these days. But in any event, back then it was a little trading outpost of the Roman Empire. But he was famous for also being an apologist. He wrote 5 books called Against the Heresies. And so this is the beginning of Christians beginning to think of there are thoughts within Christianity that are bad enough to be fought. So very early Christianity, that are first century, there's fights between Christians. We can see this from the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. There's a fight in the community. There's people fighting about what does Jesus' body mean and so on. But still, there's a sense that they're kind of generally accepting of some very broad theological diversity. 2 centuries later, at the time of Irenaeus, there's starting to be fights that are a little more specific. So it's not like what you believe about Jesus matters. And like I said, part of this is about the way that Christianity is being persecuted within the Roman Empire. Not as much as some early Christian, or some contemporary Christians talk about persecution. They were localized outbursts of persecution, but still it's enough for some of the early theologians. So Irenaeus writes these 5 big books against the heresies, and he argues again and again against these people that we today call the Gnostics. Now you might have heard me say this before, last semester, the year before. Gnostic is a modern term. That's not what those people would have called themselves before. In the 1st through 4th centuries, they would have called themselves a million different things. Valentinus was one of the teachers that we today kind of group into the Gnostics. But what the Gnostics basically were was a group. If we look at it today, again, they would have said, "No, we have nothing to do with those people." But if we're going to kind of group some thinkers, early Christian thinkers, together today, and call them Gnostics, they were folks that really believed in the fallibility of the flesh is terrible, it's bad. They believed in the immortality of the soul, and that it was a kind of pre-existent. So in other words, that there was like a kind of hierarchy of gods. There's a creator God who's good, and there's kind of like a bad God. And the bad God is the one who made flesh and bodies in the earth. Earth is bad, flesh is bad, bodies are bad. The good God, who's kind of like far away in the solar system, like way out there, is really it's kind of like a little bit detached. And our job is to kind of get back, like kind of ascend through the spiritual realm. And as a result, they didn't care that much about ethics, because it was like what happens to bodies doesn't matter that much. So I can do what I want. So there's a little bit of licentiousness, we think, in this community. At least that's the way that Irenaeus talks about it. But he writes these 5 books against this distended group. Now, what do they really believe, the Gnostics? We don't know exactly. The Gospel of Thomas seems to be associated with this group, or some part of this group. There's some other texts found in the Egyptian city of Nag Hammadi, the Nag Hammadi texts, you might have heard of these, called the Gnostic Gospels, that are kind of related to this community in a way, but we don't know exactly what they taught. But we're generally sure that they didn't like bodies. But so Irenaeus really didn't like these folks, and we can't trust exactly what he said about them. In any event, Irenaeus talks a lot about the resurrection and the flesh, because he's talking to these Gnostic folks. And here's a quote from him, from his Against the Heresies, Book 1, chapter 22. "They will indeed rise in the flesh, although unwillingly, in order to acknowledge the power of the one who stirs them up from the dead." So, in other words, some people will be like, "I don't want to rise again, I don't like my body." These Roman people who hate, or people, Gnostic people who hate their bodies. They're going to get them back whether they like it or not, right? You better be happy with it. But he also says that he ties the incarnation he's the first theologian who really explicitly ties the incarnation to the resurrection. That is, God took on flesh to save flesh as a whole. So he says, this is a quote from Irenaeus from Against Heresies, if flesh did not have to be saved, the word of God would never have been made flesh. So he still has a little bit of this distaste for flesh, but still he's like, once God became stuff became good. So, and then he explicitly ties this to the Eucharist. First theologian we know of to say, taking the Eucharist is about God, God's body, our bodies itself, the world itself, the material world. And this is his quote: "For just as that bread, the Eucharist, that is from the earth, is grew up, it's grains, it's just stuff from the earth. That stuff of the earth, when it receives the invocation of God," when you say the mumbo jumbo, when you say those words, right? Something happens, something real happens here. It's no longer common bread. It becomes Eucharist, consisting of two realities, earthly and heavenly. So also our bodies receiving the Eucharist are no longer corruptible, but have the hope of resurrection. I think he's doing a couple of things here. One is he's saying there's a real thing that happens, and someday we can maybe have a class on the Eucharist, like this is a big fight, like what actually happens, what happens here, or sacraments. The sacrament, right, this kind of thing that happens in the world that shows God's power in some way is symbolically revealing of it. That's the fight, whether it's real or symbolic. So anyway, this kind of, and also that's how the Episcopal Church exists, right? That fight, whether it's real or symbolic. We say it's both. But this tying together the Eucharist, the stuff of the earth, to the incarnation, Christ comes into the bread, and also the body of humans, and then now that gives us the hope of resurrection. Those things are all finally, for the first time together, put on paper right around the year 200 CE. And this, I think, is hugely important too, because Irenaeus is saying in a way that, there is no spiritual substance apart from physical substance. If you encounter God, it's through something material. God doesn't come out of nowhere. Even if God just speaks to you, I just heard a voice from God. Well, guess what? Voices are things. They're real. They're material. Sound waves are real. Or the neurons, the neurons in your brain that work when you have internal thoughts, that's electrical impulses actually happening. There's real stuff happening. There's nothing that happens purely spiritually. So, in other words, if you want to deal with humans, if God wants to deal with humans, it has to be through stuff. And that's this real claim here. But also, if humans are something, it has to be through stuff. And so for him, the resurrection has to be stuff-based. Now, exactly what it is, Irenaeus deals with some of these questions like, what happens if the animal eats you and then the person eats that animal and so on. He says, who cares? Right, so that's basically his thing is anything's possible with God, he says. End of story, right? Our next theologian in our lineup of theologians, and if you're bored of theologians, I'm sorry, we have two more. And then we'll move on to other interesting things like liturgy. Origen of Alexandria, African theologian from Alexandria, Egypt, from the 3rd century. So we're kind of moving into the 3rd century here. He died around the year 253. Famous for several reasons. Number one, first major heretic. Although he was after he died, that he was declared a heretic and they burned a lot of his stuff. We have some of his writings, but not all of them because a lot of them got burned. Also famous for self-castrating. He seemed to have thought that human sexual impulses were maybe not so great, and that was kind of made also part of the reason he was made heretical. Early theologians didn't want that to happen anymore. But Origen, I should say positively, Origen seems to be one of the most creative and I think really interesting theologians of the early church. And a lot of the stuff that was declared heretical in him or whatever still was hugely influential, and it actually informs a lot of the Christianity we have today. So I think this is a hugely important person who today kind of is like a funny sideshow for a lot of theologians, but I think he's actually much more important than he's been given credit for. But he seems to be the first Christian to introduce some of the philosophical Greek. He was real smart, read a lot of Greek philosophy, and introduced some, so basically early Christians were like, okay, well, what happens if you have a beard or not, naturally, do you go to the bathroom or not, or what happens if an animal eats you, and so on. And Origen says, you know what, there's some really smart Greek philosophers who have talked about the same question for a long time. And in fact, Plato and Aristotle have long discourses about this very question. And in fact, there's this ancient Greek problem of the boat. You ever heard of this one? Where let's say Theseus' ship. So let's say Theseus, this kind of Greek king, right, gets on a boat and he starts to sail. And every day he replaces one plank on the ship. By the end of the trip, he's replaced every single plank on the ship with a new plank. Is it the same ship or not? So it's a philosophical question, right? And there's two ways to answer this. One is sort of looking at what we call nominalistically. And like, if all the same pieces aren't there, then it's not the same thing, new thing, different thing. Another way to think of it is more process thinking. Things change over time. And so when you name something, you don't name, like Brennan is not this. Brennan is a process. Brennan breathed me. I'm a process. And me 20 years ago, I might not even have any of the same atoms in my body I do, of course. But if I didn't have any of the same atoms in my body as I did 20 years ago, I'd still be the same person because that process is connected. And so Origen talks about rivers and the flow of a river. It's the same thing, even if it changes over time, even if the water in it isn't the same water that it was a few years ago. So things are connected. And he even talks about like when you there are certain like parts of town that change, but it's still that same part of town, even if nothing is in that part of town that was there 100 years ago. So, and the identity is connected. So, in other words, you can think about identity in a different way. And he says that like our body is like a river. It changes over time. And so he uses that to talk about like the kind of the flesh stuff. He says, don't worry so much about that. God can use whatever God wants to reconstitute some sort of body that is you. It still is going to have flesh or stuff, the material stuff of the earth in it, but even if it was all new stuff, it would still be you, because as long as it has some continuity with that flow, like that river of you, it's the pattern that constitutes you, not the actual stuff. So he rejects the resurrection of the flesh language, but he says, I really like Paul's language of the spiritual body. So if you have ever been like a little suspicious of the whole flesh stuff in Christianity, if that kind of strikes you as a bit odd or weird, or you don't like it, maybe Origen is your theologian. Because, and actually in the Eastern Church, they very much follow Origen in this line of thought. So in the Eastern Church, they don't talk about resurrection of the flesh, Eastern Orthodox Christians. And the Christians in the further East, the Middle Eastern Christians, they tend not to talk about resurrection of the flesh. To them, they don't see that in the Bible. And they say, we don't want to pin God into that box of having to use our bones. Like, God might not want to use our bones to make our spiritual body. We don't want to hold God to that. We don't want to like get mad if that's not what happens. So, Western Christians tend to worry that this is going to de-emphasize stuff and human bodies. There's a concern that we might treat each other differently if we don't think that each other's bodies are important things to God. So there's a worry about that, right, within the church. But Origen may be your person. Gregory of Nyssa, this is our last theologian for the day. Gregory of Nyssa is one of the Cappadocians. So Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil of Caesarea, and Macrina, the sister of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea. They're a kind of a family of theologians that all came from different. Well, some of them came from different places. They all end up in Cappadocia, in the kind of central Turkish region, or what's today Turkey, then Asia Minor. And they all become very famous theologians, and they are basically the theologians that are very influential for the Eastern Church, although they are influential for the Western Church as well, but they're seen as kind of the key thinkers of the Eastern Church. If you ever go to Istanbul, beautiful place, and you go to the Kyrie Church, Kyrie Cami, one of the best preserved medieval Byzantine churches, you'll see this image along with Gregory of Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus and so on. Although Macrina didn't make a list, she's a wonderful theologian, but anyway, but you'll see these images of these folk, and this is where that's taken from, the Kyrie Cami in Istanbul, what used to be Constantinople. So this is what Gregory says in his work De Anima, on the soul. And he talks about the sort of, no matter how much your body is split up and so on, that God has this kind of like a homing system, like a beacon system or whatever, for kind of pulling all this stuff together, and this is his solution to the problem of the body. So if you don't like Origen's thing, if you like the body more than Origen does, the physical body, and you want to know, how do you solve this philosophical problem of like the animal eating you, etc., Gregory, this is your person. And this is his quote. The soul, and when he's talking about this, he talks about like the soul is kind of connected to the body. It's like, it's a function of your body. What we might call today epiphenomenal, like, or another way to think of it is emergent, an emergent thing. So you put your body together, and then the soul kind of comes about. It kind of is produced in a way by your physical body. So the soul remains after dissolution, like in this kind of distended state. Like, what happens to your soul when your body dies? If your body gets put together, it creates a human soul, like it produces it, like a function of it. What happens when it falls apart? He says, well, the soul's kind of there, but it's in this dissolute state. It's kind of pulled apart into pieces. And it's in those elements in which it existed from the beginning, like a guardian placed over private property. It's kind of a cool image. So in other words, like your body dissolves into the ground over time. Let's say you get cremated and thrown to the wind, right? You get thrown in the ocean, and carried around. Little bits of your soul are like hovering over, right? Like, almost the same way that like, if you think of like a light bulb producing light or something like that, it's like when you break the light bulb and scatter it around, it's like the soul, like the little pieces of a human body are still so important after death that they produce this little bit of light. That's the soul. And it just kind of hangs over those little pieces of your body, no matter where it goes, even if it's mingled with kindred elements, scattered around. But by the keen ubiquity of power, it abides patiently in the dissolution of the straying elements. So it's just like hangs on. There's like a little bit of power that's left over. And then it joins the kindred elements and gets mixed up in other elements, but it's not exhausted by keeping up with them when it's poured back into the universe. Rather, it, that is this power of the soul, remains in them always, wherever and however nature rearranges them. And if there should be a signal from the power of all things, that is, if God pushes the bat signal, right? And then everything, all these dissolute elements will combine again, as if various ropes fastened together at one starting point. They likewise will all respond to the pull at the same time. So God's going to push the bat signal, and like the ropes will, kind of come together. So in like manner, by the one power of the soul, then there is a pulling of the various elements suddenly, this coming together of the private property. That is like he's not talking about Locke, but it's like the little bits of power of the soul that are coming out of each piece of stuff. This cord of our body will be twisted together with the soul, each returning to its former neighbor and embracing what's familiar. So this is his idea for like the kind of almost like magnetism. Like you turn on the electricity and the magnet kind of like pulls everything together. It's going to be like that. It's kind of power that's residual in the body. So he also, I think this is really kind of funny and interesting. He has what's that guy, Oscar Wilde, like the Portrait of Dorian Gray. He's got a Portrait of Dorian Gray in Vision of the Hereafter. So, what are you going to look like? He says, oh, it's not based on what you look like here. It has nothing to do with that. What you look like is what you did on earth. You're going to look like what you deserve. so he said, just as at present the variation of elements in us determine the differences in each one's characteristics, with each changing his or her shape and the color of her complexion based more or less on the arranged elements. In other words, you have the color of skin you have because your DNA says you do, whatever. So it seems to me these factors determining the form of each person will not be these elements. Your DNA is not going to determine what you look like in the hereafter. Rather, the qualities of each person's evil or virtue will become explicit, and their unique combination of one way or the other will create the form. So you can be like, oh, I know you were a bad person, like before, whatever. So this works its way, and to close out, just to point out, and again, we'll come back to some of these images and other cultural manifestations of resurrection theology next week, but we can see this working its way into liturgy. We have a pretty good sense that by the 1st or 2nd century, the Roman Church has a very organized liturgy, and also the Church in Jerusalem has a very organized liturgy. They seem to be kind of different, and over time they have to kind of fight with each other and create the liturgy that we know today. But by the 4th, 5th century, there's a very regularized, standardized text of the Ordo Defunctorum, the order for the dead, the prayers for the dead, the liturgy for the dead. And it has this part, it's kind of my Redeemer. It's kind of borrowing from the book of Job again. You formed me from the earth and dressed me in flesh. Lord, resuscitate me on the last day. So we know that every single person who dies within what we think of today as kind of the Western church is prayed over with this prayer about being resuscitated in the last day of the flesh and so on. So we know it's not just these theologians talking about this stuff. I mean, everyday Christians are engaging this stuff. This text comes from the 4th, 5th century. We're pretty sure, based on other quotations of it and so on, that it probably dates to the 1st, 2nd century. Like, I mean, very early Christians are taking part in this liturgy. The Mozarabic funeral liturgy, we've got an inscription of it from this church right here. You can see the archaeological excavation of it in Spain from the 5th century, which says, I believe that my Redeemer will raise me to life, and in my flesh I shall look upon my Lord. Again, it's a quotation from the book of Job, but talking about the flesh, using the flesh. This is from a Christian epitaph in Rome from the 5th century, and again, it's kind of, in my flesh I'm going to see God. This seemed to be hugely important to early Christians. And just to show you one last image, the tomb of Abbess Araperga from Pavia in Italy. Pavia, it's northwest Italy, not too far from Milan. There was a convent of nuns, and they all had these beautifully decorated tombs in which their body was lying, and all of them had these bodily images. That's like the hand of God that's going to come to heal her, and so it has these inscriptions all around that are all about how their flesh is going to revive and so on. This would have been kind of their bones, their body would have been placed in this tomb and then covered over. And here's Bernward of Hildesheim. who also himself actually had lots of bodily ailments throughout his life, was a very famous and important theologian and bishop of Hildesheim in Germany, right around the year 1000 CE. And he had inscribed all over his tomb all this stuff about the resurrection of the flesh, and that I'm going to see God in my flesh, and my own eyes are going to see God, and so on, showing the power of this theology for someone especially who had dealt with bodily suffering throughout their life. That he was going to, he didn't want to get away from his body, but he thought he was going to be revived with it and in a renewed state. So, next week we're going to come back and talk a little bit about depictions of the resurrection, and you asked about this, and here's one of the earliest Christian depictions of the resurrection we have. This is from a tomb, a sarcophagus from the 4th century in Rome, and here we have sort of I'll get to that next week, but here, if you look at this little scene right here, we have the cross, and then we have 2 soldiers who seem to be sitting on kind of stone benches, and one of them seems to be sleeping. And on top of the cross, we have a wreath, which the Romans would have used to crown people who had saved someone. So, like, you know, when the emperor gets crowned with like a crown of usually like oak leaves or whatever, you know, this kind of like ceremonial crown. You see like cartoons of Julius Caesar, he's wearing one of these oak leaves. Anyone who saved someone's life in the Roman Empire would have been crowned with this kind of garland. And so here we have this kind of victorious salvation garland with a chi and a rho for Christos, for Jesus Christ. And you see these 2 doves kind of looking up adoringly at this symbol. And so the victory, so these Roman soldiers are probably like the guardians of the tomb. They don't even, like one of them's kind of looking like, oh, what's going on? And they don't even notice, right? In the gospel stories, the soldiers are terrified and run away, but also seem not to have understood what's happened. What's happened is the victory of Christ. And here you see this kind of, you'll see this today, you know, on crosses around the time of Easter. People put a cloth on there, right? So here's the cloth of Jesus, kind of, his body was rolled in, you know, kind of flapping in the wind, and the victory sign of Christ above. So the symbolic depiction of the resurrection is what we'll start with next week. Questions, comments?
Can you explain what Sheol is?
Oh, yeah. Sheol is an ancient Near Eastern, it's the Hebrew word for a broader conception, basically Mesopotamian idea, Syria, like those kind of Middle Eastern, ancient Middle Eastern folks. They had this idea that like when you die, something continues from you, but it's this like very minimal state of existence. And so they would have, oftentimes, in the places where they would bury people, they would have like little funnels, and you could like pour little libations, like little drink offerings down there, kind of keep the elders happy who had died before you. But really, it was like this kind of a minimal kind of existence, and not a happy place. So in other words, it's like when you die, you go down to Sheol, and you're just really sleepy down there, and you don't move very much.
I always thought of it as a little bit of a purgatory of some kind.
Yeah.
Where do you go when you're in that state?
So Sheol is just understood as this big giant grave underneath the earth, and you just lie there forever. And so you can go down there happy if you have, like in ancient Israelite culture, if you have lots of children, that's a big part of this, or if you can't have lots of kids, if you have in some way like left a name for yourself. That's why making a name for yourself is so important in ancient Israelite culture. It's the way you live on. So if you've left the world in such a way that you've done what you wanted to do, you had a happy, good life, a full life, a long life, and you've left some sort of mark afterwards, then you can go down to Sheol happy. But if you go down there early, young, you haven't done what you wanted to do, you haven't accomplished what you wanted to do yet, if things are like broken in your family, you go down to Sheol, whatever, you're unhappy. And so you start to like mourn. And, so you can be in Sheol happy, like you're kind of content, like I did what I wanted to do, I'm going to sleep for eternity, rest in peace. Or I'm just going to be upset forever. That's the way it is. So there's not really a conception of a happy hereafter in ancient Israel, it seems. Yeah. Yes?
I read this week Richard Rohr comparing the flesh to ego and Paul's readings.
Yeah. So right. So like in Romans. So when Paul uses flesh, he uses it in a pretty negative sense.
That's how he was trying to counter that.
Right.
Rohr was.
Right. So yeah, this so when Paul uses body, it's often in a generally positive sense, and when he uses flesh, it's generally this kind of like picky bad sense, like it's the sinful part of it that I don't want to do. And yeah, a lot of people today would say, And precisely because of this, like a recuperation of the notion of flesh through resurrection imagery, people want to say, maybe the flesh isn't so bad, you know? Like maybe my hands are okay. Like I can do bad things with them, but I can do good things with them too. So I think Rohr is somebody who might say, yeah, you can do good things or bad things with this, but that to me it's like your ego. Like your ego can be healthy, it can be unhealthy. Like, but it's not bad in and of itself. Does that make sense?
I think he was trying to reinforce not to feel dualistic about your body, that it's bad, and all of that. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting way to enter that without trying to be confused because of our ego-centric.
Gotcha. Yeah. Right. So like, when Paul's talking about flesh, and we think of it as just body. But he's thinking of it. Yeah, we feel guilty. Yeah, right. Right. Paul's definitely using that in a very particular way. Like bad will is another way of thinking about it. The way that Paul uses that phrase. Or other early Christians don't use flesh to mean bad will, and in part that's like a kind of a legacy of their ancient Israelite and Jewish heritage that the flesh is good. So, Paul's a little more Greco-Roman maybe in the sense of this. Other questions? Or?
Well, it does be interesting to think about what Paul would have written if he didn't have to write against in the context of the Greco-Roman, because he wouldn't have been such an apologist, like trying to help the Greco-Romans figure out how they can embrace this.
Yeah, right. I mean, what would he have said, because he's writing, what we have is in the church in Corinth. It's a very Gentile community. But what would Paul have said to Jews about this? That, even Hellenistic Jews, but still, where he could kind of lay aside any concerns about what Greco-Romans had with the body and so on, and actually talk with Jews. We don't know, unfortunately, what his sort of sermons would have been to them. Although Romans might contain some of that, but we think that actually the letter of the Romans is written to a community that had a lot of Jews, and that Jews were actually kicked out of Rome for a little while because they were suspect. And Christians, Gentile Christians, were allowed to stay, it seems, in the 50s CE. So the letter of the Romans is basically trying to convince the Gentile community in Rome to accept the Jewish Christians back in a way, who are now allowed to come back to the city and to not be exclusive against them. So in any event, he's still writing to Gentiles. All that stuff about in the book of Romans about Jews is really written to Gentiles about Jews. So in any event, what Paul said, I don't quite know. It's the confusing thing.
The Jews were kicked out by the Jews or by the Romans?
By the Romans. The Roman Empire kicked the Jews out of the city of Rome in like 50 or 49 or something like that CE. They were suspicious of rebellion, right? So Jews several times rebelled against Rome within Palestine, and so they were suspicious of that. Well, especially the Gentiles. Yeah. All right, great. If you feel okay, say after.